Hey guys, Necroxis here, and Hazzikostas just finished his big Warlord 6.2 Q&A, so I wanted to go through a lot of it with you guys to bring up some interesting points that they mentioned, maybe some counter-arguments, some praise words needed, and yeah, so let's get right into it. I don't have the actual questions because I couldn't be bothered to screenshot every single question, so I just basically made a list of things over here, so when I'm looking down at the computer, I'm looking at my giant list of things. So the first thing they talked about was flying. And it's because they wanted to clarify some questions people had about flying after their big announcement that they will be bringing flying back, but it's gated behind this kind of content that you have to do a bunch of things to basically prove you've gone through the game basically the first time in Blizzard's way. And then after that, completing all the things means that you have done that, and then you can fly. So they flat out said that flying isn't coming to because there are bug fixes that need to happen with the world and some slight tweaks to make Draenor completely smooth flying-wise. It had nothing to do with wanting to make it take longer. They didn't want to force people to have to go through Tanaan Jungle for weeks and weeks and weeks before they can fly. It just happened that they didn't want to delay the patch 6.2 by having to add in flying to it and then make the patch take a month longer to come out. So that's the first thing they talked about. And basically then Ian flat out admitted that the player feedback is why flying came back. They said they're watching player reception of the new gated flying model coming in 6.2 to see how it goes forward, but they are planning to try and do a model similar to this, and to take a model similar to this and go forward in future expansions, which is good. They did say that they were sad people believed they were lied to. A lot of people, myself included, felt like Blizzard implied that they were going to add flying later on. And when they announced that there would be no flying in 6.2, a lot of players, myself included, I made a video about it, got really upset. They felt that we were lied to. They're sad that people believe this. They didn't intentionally do it. They're sympathetic to players who felt upset when they revealed initially there would be no flying, and then people were upset. But they really never were planning on adding flying back until the feedback from that announcement came out. And even at that time, when they announced there would be no flying, it was not full consensus, they said, but just the majority opinion of people who were working on the game. After the announcement, they realized that saying they would never add flying back, the word never is a powerful word, and that combined with the feedback both externally and internally from people on their own team who did want to fly, they felt like they were taking away something valuable from players who had earned all those crazy mounts, like Memoron's head and, Kael'thas's mount. They felt like they were taking away a almost intangible but very important part of the game from a lot of players. So they feel like the new change where you can fly but you have to work for it is a really good compromise. And I have to say myself personally, I 100% agree. I never said that flying should just be available immediately in the game. I have never advocated for that. I was totally fine with how it worked in Wrath of the Lich King. You had to wait till level 77 before you could buy that cold weather flying tomb or whatever. Cataclysm, having flying available right away I would acknowledge it did kind of take away some of the importance of exploring the zone's scale and majesty for the first time on the ground. I would flat out admit that. Mists of Pandaria, it did it well too, and I feel like this model is great as well. So, they moved on to the factions. They flat out admitted that the 6.0 factions were mob grinds, but interestingly enough, they did reveal that they were added late in the development process. They didn't really see a need for having to earn faction cred in Warlords of Draenor. And it didn't really come into the game until they started adding stuff like trading post quirks into the garrisons. Then they realized, well, the trading post doesn't have a lot going for it, so maybe if we can add in a couple reputations, and that kind of evolved from there into the reputations we found now. This unfortunately did set up perception of reputations as a whole in all of the entire game back a couple years, they said, and they're sad that it happened. They flat out admitted that they recognized people thought that reputations took a giant step back from Mists of Pandaria. But they said that 6.2 reputations will work slightly differently. I can confirm, having been playing on the PTR, and you guys, if you've been watching my series, can see it as well. They work a little bit differently. You cannot grind reputation for the Horde and Alliance faction. The Horde one is Vol'jin's Headhunters. The Alliance one is the Hand of the Prophets. You can't grind them just from mobs. you can only do them through dailies, and while they didn't mention it, I did notice all of the garrison campaigns did give you reputation for those. So you can do that from that, and in fact, you got so much reputation from the garrison campaign that you actually could hit honored just by doing it. Like, even if you just wanted to do that every single week, you would hit honored while doing none of the other dailies. But I mean, the dailies are really easy. They go by relatively quickly, and they give you a decent amount of reputation. So if you're trying to get flying, I would go for it. The Order of the Awakened is specifically designed around hunting rare mobs and treasures, so you can't just go out and grind that reputation. And finally, the Saber Stalkers are kind of like a combination of the current Warlords design, where you can just, if you want to, you can just spend 8 hours killing mobs and getting that to Revered. You can also do dailies. You can also buy like little flags that will spawn elites that will give you more reputation. So they're trying to differentiate how the reputations work after the pretty much universal backlash of them in 6.0. So they mentioned how quickly it would take to get each of these 3 to Revered. To get that flying achievement, this is still kind of related to flying. They started out talking almost exclusively about flying, and then went into garrisons, which is what we'll be covering next. They said that the time length of getting each of the 3 factions to Revered should not take months and months, even if you play casually. But if you do dailies every day, the longest it should take is 2 to 3 weeks at the most. And I can confirm, I am basically already at Revered with Vol'jin's Headhunters, and I haven't been doing them every day. I am halfway through Honored already with the Order of the Awakened, and I don't do those frequently at all, but you get 1800 reputation. Just think, if you're playing a human character, how much more you get than that. You get another 180 rep just for doing it every day. Just killing out 10 rare mobs or finding 10 treasures. And once you hit Honored, you can get the treasure map of Draenor, which will show you where everything is. So, you know, it's a lot easier than I think Blizzard even themselves admitted. It takes, I wouldn't say 2 to 3 weeks. I would say if you do the garrison campaign every single week, you do the dailies every single day, maybe 2 weeks it'll take you to get Hand of the Prophet or Vol'jin's Headhunters to Revered. You should get Order of the Awakened before that, and you can just spend an entire day if you want getting Saber Stalkers to Revered, and that'll be it. So, now moving on to dailies, which is kind of segueing away from flying, but still talking about reputations. They flat out admitted, like I tweeted, they overreacted to the criticism of too many dailies in Mists of Pandaria. They swung the pendulum far too much in the other direction, they said. They feel like they haven't executed the Apexis daily in the correct way. That is kind of like the only one that's in the game. By comparison, they tried to compare the Apexis to the Golden Lotus, which they felt was very narrow and constricted. Players did the same 3 or 4 things 12 plus times. They didn't feel like that was fun and engaging content. I mean, honestly, after like the second time, you pretty much have done all of the Golden Lotus dailies, which they're right. But what they were trying to do with the Apexis dailies was providing different ways to complete that daily. You know, like killing mobs or getting treasures or destroying items or killing rares. They admitted that they failed in this regard. I will agree, there was nothing really engaging about doing them. You kind of just signed up to the group finder and just steamrolled an area until you were done, and then you left. The second problem they ran into with the Apexis dailies is they failed to include, they mentioned 2 other problems beside that. The first one is they failed to include any story behind the Apexis dailies. There was really no reason you were going out to Nagrand or Shadowmoon Valley or Gorgrond or Talador. There was not a story reason you were going to go there. There was a little 2-sentence blurb on your little UI, but there was no real reason to have gone back there after you've done that storyline and have solved the problem or progressed the story. There was no point in going back there. So that's the first problem. The second one is people were confused. There was confusing conveyance, and conveyance is them communicating to you as the player. And they felt that initially for Apexis dailies, there was confusing conveyance of Apexis as just a currency. Players were initially not sure, they said, what the Apexis was used for, and eventually when they discovered, you know, the vendors in Ashran, they realized that Apexis gear was too expensive and not as good as a lot of other stuff in the game, so they just gave up on doing the daily. Now, once again, they're comparing this to 6.2, and there's a lot more structure to the daily quest, which I can acknowledge. When you get like 3 or 4, you can... The way that it kind of works, I'm going to use Hand of the Prophet or Headhunters again, because that's the one they talked about as somehow taking the longest, which I don't necessarily agree. I think the The Saber Stalkers will take the longest for me personally because I find grinding just completely boring. But talking about the faction, the Horde and Alliance faction in 6.2, the way that it works is you show up in the day, so you log on for the first time in the day. You show up to your base in Tanan. They have the table just like it works now. You pick one of two things to do. You complete it. You come back. Then you're given 3 other dailies. One of them is complete two bonus objectives anywhere you want. Another one is a rotating kind of daily where it could be like, go get 100 fangs, or go kill 20 demons, or go, kill 10 Arakoa or something like that. There's other ones in there mixed in there too. And the third one usually is more specific, like go to this area and do this thing. So, it's less contained. It takes you around the entire area. So, I mean, in that regard, they have succeeded. And they have admitted, and I can attest to this, there are a lot more things to do with the Pexus crystals. You can, if you are good at grinding them, you can gear up your entire character in 695 gear just through Pexus crystals. Granted, you're going to be spending a lot of Pexus crystals, but you can do that. You can buy a piece of gear for every single slot at 650 for 5,000. If it's a weapon, it's 10,000. And then you can buy a token for 20,000 that will upgrade any one of those to 695. So if you want, you can literally, someone did the math, I don't know it off the top of my head, I had read it at one point, but I forgot it. You can get every single piece of gear up to 695. Granted, it'll take a while, but if that's how you want to gear up, you can do that. You can also get the mount, which costs like 150,000, I think, and there are some other things in there. There's some shipyard stuff, but yeah, so there's that. So then they moved on to leveling, and they said they're very proud and happy with leveling. However, they realized that garrisons were not received in the best way that they intended. They wanted players who played a variety of styles to find garrison important. Someone who raids, someone who PvPs, someone who does pet battles, someone who just grinds, someone who does professions. Their goal was trying to make garrisons do something for everybody. So doing that, inevitably, they tied a lot of systems into the garrisons. And a lot of those systems were originally tied to the outdoor world. For example, they brought up mining and herbalism several times. People who like to do that originally had to go out into the world. I mean, I've had an herbalist for like 4 or 5 years now, and I remember flying around Northrend looking for herbs, flying around Twilight Highlands is what I did in Cataclysm, finding herbs. I don't do that anymore. I just sit in my garrison, do my herbalism every day, do my ore every day, and it was more optimal to do that. It was faster, but the trade-off is they acknowledge that people realize those professions seem less important. So, in trying to tie a lot of systems to the garrisons, they realized that they took away a lot of stuff from the actual world. So, what they're trying to do in 6.2 is undo some of that. Not all of it, but some of it. So I'm getting off track on my notes, but let's see. The examples they mentioned were miners and herbalists who used to farm things in the world and sell them for a nice profit, but now everybody has more herbs and ore they can deal with. Has more than they can deal with, I mean. So while Blizzard does believe that there is a lot of endgame content in the game right now, their mistake was to, by comparison, make it easier to do a lot of the same things just in the garrison. So they said they really like the concept of the garrison. They really like for people who could only log on like 5 to 10 minutes before work, showing up, collecting their ore and their herbs, getting people back from missions, sending them on their missions, collecting their rewards. However, they witnessed people who spent like an hour or more playing, finding non-garrison things not worth the effort. For example, what's the point of going out to farm herbs when you can just do them in your garden? So that's what they mean with that. Their solution in 6.2 is to move more of the valuable rewards out of the garrison into the world. They use the point of Fellblight, which is, if you don't know, Fellblight is used to upgrade the crafted items to their most, to their most powerful form in 6.2. Originally, you had to get Savage Blood, which you could get from the garrison, but you cannot get Fellblight from the garrison. You have to go out into the world and do something. I don't remember what you're supposed to do, but you can only get them out in the world. So they made a TLDR on their own. They said garrisons over-rewarded you, and they're moving more toward back being out in the world. So, connected to garrisons are shipyards. They mentioned that shipyards are much less micromanagey than the rest of the garrisons. They feel that players are pretty much burned out on the point, click, and wait method of garrison. I called it the Facebookification in previous games. The same thing. They feel like players are completely burned out on this. That's why they didn't increase the follower count in 6.2 or increase followers' item levels in 6.2. They didn't want to keep reinforcing this system. So they made the Shipyard. I can agree to this next statement that they said the Shipyard requires less frequent checking in, but also tends to give you a lot better rewards than just regular garrison missions. For example, one I'm doing right now on the PTR that my guys are still on, it's a 2-day mission that rewards like 6,000 Apexis crystals. That's just like one of them. So granted, it will take longer to do Shipyard stuff, but you won't feel forced to have to check in like 4 times a day to bring your followers back, see what they got, gear them up if you haven't yet, send them back out on a mission. They don't want that to be the case anymore, and Shipyards aren't like that. Pretty much is you show up for the first time, check your Shipyard, send your stuff out, show up the next day, and they might not even be done yet. But if they are, just do the same thing again, only once a day, if that. So, let's see. I'm skipping around on this to try and keep the points together. So then there was a question about leveling. Blizzard said they're very proud and happy with how leveling worked. However, they realized... Oh, I already mentioned this, so that's my bad. Alts, that's what I meant to do. They said that Warlords was not designed, even though it seems like it, to burn people out who like to make alts. But this is also tied into the garrison problem. But they made a point to mention that they feel that alts should serve to alts should... I wrote down exactly how he said it. They believe alts should exist to serve themselves, meaning that you should make an alt because you want to do something different that your main can't do. You want to make a healing alt because your raid group needs another healer, your arena team needs a healer, wants to try one out, your RBG team needs a healer. They do not believe that alts should serve exclusively as a way to make gold or materials to then send back to your main, which they pretty much just do nowadays. I mean, Lore, the community manager who was doing the Q&A, flat out said, like, look, I have like 5 level 100s now, and all of them are just used to make gold from my main. They believe that's a failure of the system. They like alts, but they're not intending alts to work that way, and again, that ties into the problem of garrisons. They have said that while they are not exclusively doing this in 6.2, maybe, they might, but they're not planning on it yet, they might consider nerfing the gold earning missions in the garrison on your alt characters. That's just one example. And he said, I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say it's anything but a nerf, but it's a nerf. They want to alleviate the overwhelming feeling of having to have 5 or 6 level 100s to support your main. I don't have 5 or 6 level 100s, I only have 1, but I know a lot of people who have many level 100s, and they do it just for that reason. So, while I think they might be angry initially if they nerf the gold missions, I think ultimately they'll be happier because they won't feel the need to show up every single day on 6 characters and have to maintain a garrison. That sounds terrible, and I'm glad I don't do it, but I know people who are, and they hate it. Someone brought up a PvP question, or in the chat there were a lot of people yelling about PvP. They said the Q&A is not focusing on PvP, so I'm just going to get that out there. I'll mention that too. Someone asked if the garrison feature is going to continue going forward into the next expansion. They said that the garrison as we know it in Draenor is rooted in Draenor and tied to Draenor. It is the place you built your base on the planet, and your base exists on Draenor. You won't be bringing back your mine and your garden back to Azeroth for the next expansion. I don't know if that was like a random confirmation that the next expansion is on Azeroth, or it's just a turn of phrase, but that's what I thought when I heard him say that. He said, you won't be bringing it back to Azeroth, and I was like, next expansion's on Azeroth. I don't know if that was intended or not, but just that was something funny that I noticed. But they did say that the core gameplay idea of having followers and building up a base and building up an army, they want to try and somehow carry that forward if they can. But it's not going to be the exact same thing. So then we got into raiding. Someone asked a question and claimed that truly a massive number of raiding guilds have declined. Ian flat out said he does not agree with that premise. He said that they've been hearing this for a long time now, and the example he used was in Burning Crusade, the raiding guild, and I remember this happening, it's kind of funny. the raiding guild Death and Taxes disbanded in Sunwell, and everyone was like losing their minds and saying that raiding's gone. Raiding was destroyed in Burning Crusade. They do recognize, however, that a lot of people struggled moving to the strict 20-man mythic mode paradigm. They do feel like that changing this paradigm, though, is still a good idea. They feel like the change to a flex style, mob health and damage adjustments based on the number of players, they feel like that in normal and heroic has been an overwhelming success. And anecdotally, I have to agree. I know a lot more people who I've never seen raid before are raiding. And it's because they're raiding normal and they're raiding because of the flex system. So they still believe that 20-man Mythic delivers very concise, difficult, and rewarding experiences. And the benefit of having only one mode for Mythic is that there are no more balancing problems between 10 and 25 that they used to have between those heroic modes. And remember, back then, heroic was the hardest difficulty. And I remember over and over and over conversations about balancing. For example, I really specifically, for some reason, remember the conversations about balancing Mythic or heroic Ice Crown Citadel between 10 and 25. And some bosses were harder than the other in difficulty rate in the two different mind blank. I remember definitely the conversation that there were two different difficulties. Some bosses were harder or easier than others depending on if you were 10-man or if you were 25-man. And they think a really powerful upgrade or improvement is that because they just have 20-man Mythic, they don't have that problem anymore. So someone then asked the question of, is Mythic even a valid idea anymore? And they said, Mythic is valuable in the idea that there should be someone who is the ultimate best in terms of rating. They completely support that idea. They're not moving away from it. At the same time, and this is very interesting, and it's something that a lot of us have assumed but they haven't said before. They said, at the same time, the creation, existence, and maintenance of Mythic only consumes a very small amount of development time. He said 10% of development on raids at the best is spent on doing Mythic tuning and stuff like that. Most of the effort is in creating the zones from the artistic side, modeling the bosses, balancing the bosses, making the gear, testing that, tuning the encounters. An extra mechanic or two or a few different testing phases doesn't really affect things nearly as much as a lot of players think, they said. He said on average it's about 5% of the development time, but 10% at most, like I mentioned. Ultimately, he said, it's the vast majority of the player base who does LFR and normal that justifies the existence of raiding in its entirety. So I always run into those few Mythic raiders who get super upset and super just pompous and entitled and feel like they should be able to see all the other stuff and nobody does. They don't seem to realize, and Blizzard has flat out said this twice now, this is the second time they've said this, the only reason they feel worth spending so much development time and money on raids is because of the scrubs, really, the plebes that you like to fucking complain about. So many people who don't raid, or who only raid the easy difficulties, they're the ones justifying your hardest difficulty. So, maybe tune it back a little bit. So then I got into Timewalking and Warlords of Draenor dungeons. So, someone was asking questions about what's the point of Timewalking, and they said the goal of Timewalking as a bonus event, and all of the bonus events in 6.2, and there are a bunch, I haven't covered them yet, but there's Timewalking's a bonus event. It's split between Draenor and Wrath, so or BC and Wrath. So when it's time for Timewalking, it won't be both of them. It'll be one or the other. So they have those two. They have events that make you earn like 500% extra Apexis crystals or 200% bonus pet battle experience. There's a bunch of other ones. A reputation one that I can't remember, which will help going back to the beginning of the whole revered issue. They said that the goal is to condense it to really more specific activities, because then another question was asked, like, why not just make Timewalking all the time? And they said that it fills in the time between the current endgame dungeons and gearing up. If they made Timewalking available all the time, and if it gave better gear than current dungeons, why would anybody do the current dungeons? If it gives you the same or worse than the current dungeons, why would you ever do the Timewalking dungeons? By having it limited to specific days and giving you slightly better gear than the current dungeons, they feel like it fixes this problem. You feel a need to go do them when it's time to do that, but it doesn't make the other dungeons, irrelevant. And we're going to get onto the point of relevance in the current dungeons later on, but just for this point is what he means. He says, it's great for a nostalgic trip being able to do these dungeons every now and then outside of steamrolling them on your own. But, he said, it also provides a pretty interesting insight, and it's something I hadn't realized until he said it, is that when you go back and do time walking, you realize how much dungeons have improved. And I can completely agree. I ran Alcatraz on time walking, and we didn't even finish it. But I do remember that it wasn't difficult because there were lots of things going on. It was difficult just because things hit really hard. There weren't a lot of mechanics. There was like 2 mechanics at best on all the bosses. And, you know, dungeons these days really are more interesting than they used to be. So I thought that was an interesting point that I hadn't considered until he said it. So getting on to the dungeons some more, he said they really are proud of the dungeons, but without a currency like Valor, a lot of players only did them for a few weeks. And soon they outgeared them because of garrisons and LFR, so people stopped doing them. Their goal in 6.2 with Mythic Dungeons is, despite their name, not be for Mythic Raiders, but to keep players interested in them who are raiding in normal mode, because they will provide item level equivalent gear. It's getting like darker in here as I'm speaking, so sorry about the little darkness in the background. Going forward, the next dungeons they release are going to try and fix this problem of becoming quickly irrelevant. They haven't given any specifics on it yet, but they are aware that it's an issue. He talked about Valor being removed, and he made an actually pretty convincing argument. He said, they found it weird to keep giving players Valor to buy better and better items, but in the same process, the dungeon becoming easier and easier. Let me explain, because he kind of did it in a convoluted way, but I understood his point. So, using Mists of Pandaria, for example, he also used this. In 5.0, dungeons would give Valor, and you would buy Valor to buy good items. And so, but then in 5.2, those same dungeons still gave Valor, but Valor was then used to purchase more powerful items than the first tier of Valor, if that made sense. At 5.2 came out, a whole new set of Valor items came out. So you were still getting Valor as you were becoming increasingly more powerful, and they felt like it kind of diminished the value of dungeons in a way to, in 5.4, be decked out in this crazy Valor gear, but still getting Valor to buy this crazy gear from dungeons that you could like clear entire wings with AoE. So they then mentioned, someone asked a question of, why are you doing time walking instead of new dungeons? And he quickly jumped on this point to say, whoa, the colors are like switching on and off in the background. Sorry about that. If you could stop that, that'd be great. Is it stopping? Are you stopping it? Stop it. Stop. Stop. Stop it. Stop. 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 Stop it. Okay. So, he quickly jumped on that and said time walking dungeons were not added instead of new dungeons. Just because they didn't add new dungeons this patch doesn't mean they're never going to do it again. They've been thinking about and testing the time walking feature for a long time now, and they do like to add in new features in the patches, not just in the expansion launches. So they've always wanted to add this kind of new content, but in terms of what goes into each patch, he explained that it's kind of a delineation of who should do what on the team. So if they wanted to add in time walking this patch, they focused on that. However, they did say that not a lot of people were working on that because they're not adding new assets into the game. They're just kind of like scaling things up and scaling things down. So a lot of people weren't working on that. Most of the people in 6.2 were working on the raid, which makes sense because it's a gigantic raid with a lot of stuff going on. So the TLDR was time walking didn't take up new dungeon development time. They just were never planning on releasing new dungeons in 6.2. Oh, I forgot to mention this in time walking. He said, it's a great time to quickly gear up your alts, which goes back into a point earlier he was talking about alts and gearing up instead of through the garrison. You can do it through time walking. It's very similar in LFR. LFR gear is very similar to time walking gear, but you can only run LFR once a week. But if it's a time walking weekend, you can just chain run it as much as you want. He basically said time walking is Altapalooza, basically. Also, they're tying time walking to getting bonus rolls for Hellfire Citadel. So they're trying to make time walking appeal to as many people as possible. And then kind of an interesting question that I really enjoyed the answer to. Someone basically said, why are you nerfing Demonology Warlock so much? And he flat out said, we don't want you playing Demonology right now. The chat went fucking crazy, but I appreciate the point he was trying to make. He said, They're nerfing Demonology Warlocks in 6.2 because they have problems with how the spec plays. The amount of buff juggling you have to do, it's not intuitive. You need a bunch of add-ons to do it. If you want to play it well, it's super convoluted. As a Warlock who's Destruction and has tried to do Demonology, I fucking hate it. He said, so because Demonology was the best overall spec for Warlocks, and it was hands down, it was not even a question in 6.0, it was the best, they saw many players who wanted to play Destruction or Affliction being forced to try and play Demonology because of how well it was doing. They have plans to overhaul the spec, they said, but not for 6.2, but they're not planning on, because they're nerfing it, they're not planning on seeing Demonology Warlocks be the majority of Warlocks and Wraith in 6.2. They flat out said they're completely fine with that. There's an ebb and flow for what specs are good at what time, and they said now it's time for Demonology's turn to be the worst out of the Warlock specs. And they said that Affliction and Destruction are looking good in 6.2. I can acknowledge that they are. So that's that. I have to give them credit for the brutal honesty here. I've repeatedly said I really want Blizzard just to be brutally honest with us, because I'm sick of all this pussyfooting around trying not to offend everybody. This Q&A, they flat out say, like, we want you to do this, we hate this, we failed on this, we think this is good. So I can give them credit for that. So going forward, we're getting into the latter half of the explanation now. Philosophically, their goal in pruning abilities away, and they do recognize in some cases they pruned too many, is in the place they're doing it because they want the rotations to be how they fit into the game, not just the bunch of abilities. They're not designing a class rotation around fighting a training dummy. And he made the comparison to like DDR, where you're just standing there doing an order really quickly of a lot of complicated things. They're trying to make rotations relatively simple because you're doing other things in addition to your rotation. You're fighting a player, you're looking at interrupting stuff, you're keeping track of boss debuffs and buffs, you're moving around on the ground, you're running out of fire. He talked about the skill cap in the game, and he said that barely any players, if any players, are actually at the skill cap of the actual game. And they kind of like that idea. The difference between someone who's a mythic raider, like who's in Paragon, and like me, is there's a big gap, which means I have room to improve a lot. They like that idea. They don't want to have just like 60 add-ons tracking how to fight a boss, so he also explained it kind of convolutedly, but I got what he meant. He meant like he didn't want you watching on your screen like just add-ons over and over and over and over, being like, now I hit 0, now I hit 1, now I hit 2, now I hit 7, now I hit X, now I hit Y, now I hit 0 again. They don't want it to be like that. They want you to be good at your rotation in conjunction with all of the other stuff going on. So, they said that, let's see, they would rather focus, rather than making classes more complex, than improving the fantasy of the class. The feeling of being like a fire mage was his example. Many classes right now, he said, are falling short of that fantasy. He mentioned rogues, for example. They suffer as much as this as anybody else, he said. They are lacking animations that make them feel like a ninja, an ultimate badass, and what you're seeing when you're playing really isn't that impressive for that class, he said. There was a healing question mentioned that basically came down to the fact that absorption's too powerful, and while they have no plans on changing it in 6.2, they do recognize that priests in particular, if you only have one priest in your raid, if they're not disciplined, they're doing it wrong because of how powerful absorption is. They want that to change. They're going to be changing it, just not in 6.2. There was a profession question asked later on about the garrison-centric nature of gathering and crafting things. They definitely said that it was a major downfall of Warlords, that the profession was so locked to the garrison. The gathering of materials and the locking of the high-end crafting materials to the garrison work orders was a really bad idea. So 6.2, they're drastically increasing the yield of your personal cooldowns. For tailors, it's that blue cloth that we make, that blue quality cloth, whatever it's called. They're like doubling how much you get every day. Once again, we're going to bring up Fellblight again, which you have to go out into the world to obtain, and that makes the best quality gear. So, let's see, we're at the very end here. They mentioned rating mechanics. Basically, they basically said, so yeah, they were talking about how long they think boss fights should be. And they said if a boss has the same mechanics from start to finish, it should really only be about 5 or 6 minutes. If it's an endurance fight, that's the only exception, and I feel like that's where it could be longer, like Brackenspore. If it's a multi-phase fight, it should be a bit longer. And finally, for bosses that have like intermission phases and also has multi-phase fights, they're fine with it being 10 plus minutes long. They're happy with the lengths of boss fights in 6.0 thus far. They said they don't feel like the longer fights like Brackenspore were too long because it was made to be an endurance fight. They do believe that Mythic Imperator, though, was too long. 15 minutes plus is too long, they said. And finally, seeing a new phase, and this only is true of Imperator, really, but seeing a new phase you're going to have to learn and wipe on a bunch of times at like the 13-minute mark was too rough. So getting to the end of this, we got into the issue of convenience. And they said they don't want inconvenience and nuisance to stop players from doing things in the game. But at the same time, they have to be mindful of the downfall of convenience. This is basically the entire argument about flying, he said. They also brought up the portals and Cataclysm, where you could just warp around the world, and it didn't feel like the world was really disjointed, and they didn't really like that idea. They like to say putting convenience barriers where it's natural, but don't remove too many barriers to make things feel too inconvenient. There's a point where too much convenience just becomes tedium. It's a hard question to answer, but I think they were vague about it. But I ultimately agree. Going back to flying, I'm fine with how they locked it out. So then they get to the big point, and this will be the last thing I'll mention. There were a couple questions after this that weren't really too important, but they mentioned 6.1, and my phone is blowing up because I'm talking about this on Twitter still right now. But in 6.1, they said Twitter integration. So the Twitter integration in 6.1 was not taking away from outdoor content, they said. It was just a couple of programmers working to convert the Twitter API into the game. They weren't holding back a patch to make it happen, and that's my bad, because I went on a rant talking about how they made Twitter instead of other stuff, and I'll fully admit that I was wrong. They weren't taking away development time from other stuff to add in Twitter. They added it in because people already were tweeting screenshots from the game. They were trying to make it easier. They also mentioned the selfie cam at 6.1, and this is something I didn't know, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm really going to take back most of my complaints about the selfie cam. They said that it was just one designer and one programmer who did like the entire thing. They came into the office and they told people what they wanted to do, and Blizzard said, look, on your off time, go for it, have at it. And eventually they made the selfie cam, and that became a thing in the game. And the question that brought all of this up was artistic integrity. How can you still talk about artistic integrity, Blizzard, when you introduce a selfie cam? And Ian, fought back pretty hard and said Blizzard sees the idea of artistic integrity in allowing programmers to do passion projects on the side to add things into the game. He mentioned like hunter pets that were hard, that had like a challenge behind taming them, or the Brawlers Guild, stuff like that, where ultimately just a small amount of people creating a passion project. I think that's super interesting, and I didn't know that, and I wish that they would have said that earlier, because I would have given those things more credit. I still think the selfie cam is stupid, but I wouldn't have said like, oh, we didn't get something because of this, because we got selfie cam. Like, I wish they would have said that. They would have alleviated a lot of the criticisms. Finally, they said 6.1 should have been probably called like 6.0.5 in terms of player expectation, and I'm finally glad that they said this. I was talking to Howie. He admitted that him and I already had this conversation like months ago. Like, they should have just called it something else. I've had this conversation on Twitter with people. 6.1 should not have been called 6.1. He flat out said, look, it wasn't a story patch, it was an update patch. They really apologized for misleading people possibly in the scope of the patch, and they knew it wasn't going to be a big content patch the entire time. They just really wished that people didn't take it as it being one. And that's my fault, but I think that's also partially Blizzard's fault, because people were like begging for other things to do out in the world because garrisons were sucking up so much time. So there were also a couple other questions. I would suggest going back and watching the entire thing. I covered most of it here, but there are some things I left out because they weren't too interesting to me personally, and they weren't too impacting on the game overall. You can go to Twitch, Blizzard's Twitch, which is just twitch.tv/wow, WOW, and watch the entire thing if you want. But like I said from the get-go, this video is already like 40 minutes long, so I'm going to just make my final thoughts pretty quickly. This was super brutally honest, and this is what I think Blizzard should have been doing for a long time now, and I can completely appreciate, support them in that endeavor, and I like how they did it. I like how Ian pulled no punches. It got dark really quickly, didn't it? So I mean, honestly, it's only like 6 p.m. here, but it's stormy out, so that's my excuse. But I have to give them credit where credit is due. They were brutally honest. They said, like, look, we failed here, 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 and here. You know, we're flat out nerfing demonology warlocks. Get over it. Sorry, but we're doing it. You know, I would much rather have them be brutally honest with me and at least know the truth of what they're doing than have them pussyfoot around and lead people like me and like most other people to assume things that ultimately a lot of them aren't true. So, you know, I can appreciate Blizzard doing this. I really liked the Q&A. I thought it was fantastic. Revealed a lot of stuff. Ian also pretty much confirmed that 6.2 was the last raid patch. He was talking about Archimon and item drops. That's a question that I didn't cover, so you can go watch that if you want. But he let slip. He was talking about Archimon, and he said something to the effect of, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something to the effect of, Archimon is the final raid boss. The final raid boss in Warlords of Draenor. He said something to that effect. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that. And a lot of people didn't catch it. Only like 4 or 5 people in the chat caught it, and I was reading it, and I heard him say it, and I wasn't sure if that's what he meant, but then I see other people in the chat saying it too, and I was like, oh shit, he did. He inadvertently revealed that maybe that 6.2 is the final raid patch. So that's pretty interesting. Thanks, guys. Let me know what you thought of this Q&A in the comments below if you watched it. If you just listened to my thoughts on it, what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I presented all of Blizzard's thoughts. Those weren't my thoughts. I added in my opinions here and there, but I specifically made a point to talk about me. And when I said that, that was only my stuff. But the vast majority of the stuff that I mentioned was Blizzard and Ian Hazzikostas saying all that stuff. So thanks for watching, everyone, with me in my dark room that became increasingly dark as you watched on. But, yeah, so I'll see you guys next time for the next thing we hope to cover next. Redundancy is redundant. Did you not know how redundant redundancy is? But I was hoping we were going to get like a 6.2 trailer after the very end, but we didn't. So I know that Taryn Gregory, who is the cinematic director, said very, very soon something is coming. So cross our fingers. I'm expecting it to be awesome because Gul'dan, what can be so bad about Gul'dan? So thanks for watching, guys. Let me know all of your thoughts on the internet somewhere in the comments below or on my Twitter or on YouTube, whatever. And, yeah, I'll see you next time. So until then, farewell and stay awesome.